Hello, my friends. The reality of the world around us is shifting faster than many ever expected. For nearly 4 years, the war in Ukraine has dominated global headlines, yet the deeper we look, the more confusion and contradiction we uncover. Why did this conflict begin? Who is truly benefiting from its continuation? And why do Western leaders insist on prolonging a war that Ukraine cannot win? Today, we are going to strip away the slogans, the propaganda, and the political theater. We will examine the war through the lens of hard facts, battlefield realities, and the global power shifts reshaping our future. Because behind the speeches and the television sound bites lies a story of strategy, betrayal, and geopolitical transformation, a story the mainstream media has tried very hard to bury. Let's take a clear, unfiltered look at what is really happening in Ukraine and why Russia's position now shapes the fate of Europe, the West, and the world itself. When we look at the war in Ukraine as it stands at the end of 2025, the first thing that strikes any honest observer is that almost nobody in the West can clearly explain what this conflict is actually about anymore. Western governments continue to announce new aid packages and weapons deliveries, and leaders in places like the Netherlands insist they must support Ukraine. Yet if you scratch the surface, the real objective has long since drifted away from anything resembling the defense, reconstruction, or democratization of Ukraine itself. For Russia, the picture is brutally clear. The Russian-speaking population in Ukraine endured years of discrimination and violence under an unelected nationalist regime that came to power after the 2014 coup. And Moscow sees its intervention as a necessary defense of that population and of Russia's own security. For the Western elites, however, the goal is not to build a strong, sovereign Ukraine, but to weaken Russia politically, economically, militarily, even at the price of Ukraine's destruction. The mask slipped very clearly when European leaders openly framed their strategy as a two-point plan. First, weaken Russia. Second, support Ukraine in that task. There was no talk of restoring Ukraine, no serious concern about genuine democracy, reconciliation, or long-term development. Instead, the logic was stark and cynical. Ukraine is a tool, a battlefield on which Russia is supposed to bleed for years. The idea was never to help Ukraine decisively win. The idea was to create an endless war in which Russia spends resources, suffers casualties, and faces internal fatigue in the hope of provoking political change in Moscow, what the West politely calls regime change. This attitude explains why, from the very beginning, Western support has always been half-hearted and fundamentally unserious from a military point of view. In 2022, the initial waves of arms deliveries consisted largely of dusty Soviet-era equipment pulled out of storage in Eastern Europe. T-72 seconds, T-64 seconds, even ancient T-55 seconds and T-62 seconds, along with old ammunition. When it became obvious by late 2022 that Ukraine was not on a path to victory, European capitals did not suddenly pivot to delivering enough modern, integrated, state-of-the-art systems to truly change the balance of power. They couldn't. Training, doctrine, logistics, and industrial limits made that impossible. And they didn't really want to either, because the point was never a decisive victory for Kyiv. The point was to keep Russia tied down. On the ground, Ukraine has never been able to respond effectively to Russia's military superiority, not even in the first weeks. Early Western media narratives about endless Russian tank losses and spectacular Ukrainian advances have turned out largely to be propaganda, illusions designed to maintain public support and buy time. As the war dragged on, Ukraine's structural weakness became impossible to hide. The country is suffering a severe manpower crisis. The government is reduced to literally grabbing men off the streets. Countless videos show forced conscription, abductions in city neighborhoods, and protests by families terrified of seeing their relatives sent untrained to the front. Ukrainian armored units have been worn down to such an extent that they are almost absent from the battlefield. The country no longer possesses the combined arms capacity required for serious offensive operations. Most of the tactics now rely on the widespread use of small drones, which can harass Russian positions and destroy local strongpoints, but cannot hold ground, cannot break through layered defenses, and cannot replace artillery, armor, and air power in a classical sense. Drones are a tool of attrition and pressure, not a tool of victory. Meanwhile, Russia still dominates in artillery, the arm that has traditionally been Moscow's greatest battlefield strength. Ukrainian artillery is outgunned and outproduced. Without air superiority, without sufficient armor, without shells, and with an exhausted, forcibly mobilized infantry, Kiev has no realistic path to offensive success. If anything, the persistence of Ukrainian soldiers in such conditions is a backhanded testament to their personal courage. They are asked to fight and die with inadequate equipment and minimal training, and yet many still go to the front, even as desertions and casualties mount. But bravery cannot compensate for strategic bankruptcy. The West never tried to understand the actual dynamics on the ground. Instead, it hid behind a narrative of an eventual Ukrainian triumph that was never plausible. Even now, European leaders insist that it is wrong to say Ukraine is losing, as if words could override battlefield reality. The corruption scandals erupting in Kyiv merely expose another layer of this tragedy. Western funds poured into dubious projects like the so-called Flamingo missile, trumpeted as a Ukrainian-developed cruise missile with a 3,000-kilometer range, and hailed as a game-changer when the United States hesitated to send Tomahawks. The company behind it appeared out of nowhere, bathed in Western money, only for it to emerge that the program was at best immature and at worst a partial hoax. Money disappeared, results did not materialize, and now the Flamingo project looks like a failure. This is emblematic of how Western money has been mismanaged and siphoned off by networks of oligarchs, officials, and intermediaries. Yet despite this, the flow of aid is sustained not because anyone believes in victory, but because everyone fears the consequences of admitting defeat. European publics are increasingly skeptical. They understand instinctively that this conflict is a black hole into which money and lives vanish. American leaders, especially under Trump, have openly recognized Ukraine as a sinkhole. But European elites cling to their narrative, because if they concede that Ukraine is failing, the entire moral and political justification for their policy collapses. The deeper reality is that the West's true objective has always been Russia's defeat, not Ukraine's victory. This is not a zero-sum game where one side's triumph automatically equals the other's loss. Here, everyone in the West quietly acknowledges that a Ukrainian military victory over Russia is impossible. The best they hope for is to weaken Russia strategically, to force it into long-term attrition, sanctions, and isolation. Yet this plan has backfired dramatically. Militarily, Russia has adapted, mobilized, and increased its production. Economically and geopolitically, sanctions have accelerated a realignment of the global system. By trying to impose its will on the entire planet, the West has divided the world into friends and enemies, leaving no neutral space. Countries like Iran, which historically had strong cultural and intellectual orientations toward the West, now understand that in Western eyes they are irredeemable enemies, regardless of what they do, so they turn elsewhere. China has emerged as a credible alternative model of development, combining technological, industrial, and economic power with a more stable and less ideologically intrusive approach to foreign relations. As China became the locomotive of the non-Western world, others realized they no longer had to accept Western domination to develop. 40 years ago, being cut off from the West meant being cut off from modernity. Today, being cut off from the West simply means pivoting to the East. Russia has understood this shift clearly. For decades, Moscow tried to move closer to Western Europe, to integrate economically and technologically with the EU. But when the West chose to weaponize energy and finance, to cut pipelines, seize assets, and sanction everything it could, it forced Russia to turn decisively toward Asia. The Russian double-headed eagle has always faced both West and East. Now, by necessity, its gaze has settled on the East. Putin and other Russian leaders have said openly that they no longer trust the West and must build a new ecosystem of trade, finance, and technology with partners who are more stable and less ideological: China, India, Iran, and the broader BRICS world. Western sanctions, meant as a mortal blow, have instead been treated as a structural reality in Moscow, handicaps that push Russian industry to innovate, diversify, and deepen cooperation with Asia. The result is a growing gap between the Western Bloc and the rest of the world, with Russia firmly embedded in the latter. Energy is at the heart of Europe's dilemma. During the Cold War, Soviet and then Russian gas flowed reliably to Europe for decades. Even at moments of intense political confrontation, Moscow never used energy as a coercive tool to extract geopolitical concessions. Trade agreements were honored as trade agreements. Politics and strategy were separate spheres. The West, by contrast, has shown itself to be unreliable, willing to rip up long-term arrangements overnight for political reasons. Europe is not truly dependent on Russia. It is dependent on cheap, stable energy. And when Russia was pushed out, the only remaining major supplier was the United States, a country determined not to provide affordable energy, but to profit. Under the America First doctrine, Washington seeks to rebuild its own industry and wealth, which means selling liquefied natural gas and oil to Europe at high prices, slapping tariffs on European exports, and demanding concessions in return. The Russian model was one of mutually beneficial interdependence. The American model is naked self-interest. At the same time, Europe is financially strained, with soaring budget deficits and aging populations. Yet instead of investing in social stability and economic competitiveness, European leaders are doubling their defense budgets, loudly proclaiming the need to militarize society in response to a supposedly imminent Russian invasion. This narrative is absurd, but it serves a purpose. It provides political cover for diverting resources away from welfare and subsidies toward arms and rearmament. Countries like France are running their highest deficits in decades, but still commit to massive defense spending increases. To justify this, they must present Russia as an existential threat, predicting attacks on Europe in 2 or 3 years. In reality, this is not strategy, but panic. Western elites operate on short-term reaction, not long-term planning. They failed to anticipate Russian resilience in Ukraine and are now trapped in their own rhetoric. Against this backdrop, diplomatic maneuvers around peace plans look almost theatrical. At one stage, American figures floated a 28-point document. The Europeans drafted their own revisions. The Ukrainians tried to edit it further to suit their preferences. Political figures shuttled between Geneva, European capitals, and now Moscow, as if they could impose a settlement from above. But the hard truth is that Russia is winning on the ground and therefore holds the decisive leverage. Without Russian consent, no plan has any meaning. Moscow's understanding of negotiations, as Putin has explained, is classic and straightforward. Both sides come to the table with demands. They make reciprocal concessions and gradually move toward a compromise that both can accept. This process can take months or years. As in Vietnam or Algeria, it cannot be replaced by Western diktats dressed up as peace proposals. And what the Europeans and Ukrainians have apparently done in recent weeks is to rewrite the original American plan into a shorter document with fewer points but even more substance tilted towards Ukrainian wishes. Far from bringing positions closer together, this widens the gap between Kiev's expectations and what Moscow would tolerate. The negotiation timeline thus lengthens, not shrinks. Meanwhile, Russia continues to advance militarily. Over the last month, Russian forces reportedly achieved their highest rate of daily territorial gain since the start of the special military operation, on the order of dozens of square kilometers per day, adding up to hundreds over the month. The dynamic on the battlefield is in Russia's favor, and no amount of paper shuffling in Geneva or Brussels can change that. The more time the West spends crafting documents tailored to Kiev's fantasies, the more ground Russia will take, making any future compromise even more unfavorable to Ukraine. It is crucial to understand that the 4 regions Russia has already incorporated, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, are not Moscow's ultimate war aims. They are preconditions for serious negotiations. Putin has been explicit. If Ukraine wants a ceasefire and a political settlement, it must withdraw its forces from the administrative borders of those regions and formally abandon the goal of NATO membership. Only then can talks truly begin. There is no indication that Russia has retreated from this position. If Russian forces secure those territories militarily before negotiations even start, they will not simply stop. They will continue to push until their broader objectives, demilitarization and denazification, are met. Suggestions and some draft plans for amnesty for war crimes and immunity for key Ukrainian figures are simply non-starters. From Moscow's perspective, if Kyiv's leadership and extremist militias are granted blanket amnesty, there will be no real denazification and no guarantee against future attacks. That would only pave the way for a new war in a few years. If no acceptable political agreement is reached, the likely outcome is not a negotiated peace but Ukrainian capitulation. In that scenario, questions of war crimes and accountability will be handled on Russian terms. Moscow has made it clear that it views events such as the killings in places like Bucha, the atrocities in the Kharkov and Kherson regions, and earlier crimes in Odessa and on the Maidan as grave crimes committed by Ukrainian extremists, often backed or shielded by Western patrons. The West's refusal to allow truly joint or international investigations, including Russia, has undermined its own narrative. Commissions staffed only by Western allies, whose reports then quietly disappear from public discussion, convince no one. There is ample testimony emerging from formerly Ukrainian-held regions about abuses, torture, and extrajudicial killings carried out by Ukrainian units, including foreign mercenaries who have no emotional ties to the local population. Mercenaries are paid to fight, not to protect civilians. And history shows they are more likely to commit atrocities precisely because they lack any sense of shared identity with the people living in the war zone. By contrast, many of the fighters on the Russian side in Donetsk and Lugansk are locals, men from the region who took up arms as militias to defend their own cities and families. It is always possible that Russian forces have committed individual war crimes. War inevitably produces such incidents on all sides. But there is a fundamental difference between incidental crimes and systematic, ideologically driven terror against civilians. For Moscow, the intent is to protect the people of Donbass and the broader Russian-speaking population, whom they see as their own. For nationalist battalions in Kyiv's orbit, and for foreign legionnaires flown in from across the world, the local population is often viewed with suspicion or even hatred. When Ukraine sends elite nationalist units and mercenaries into contested regions, the likelihood of atrocities increases. Testimonies from areas like Kupiansk and other liberated zones suggest that Ukrainian formations behaved with exceptional brutality, something Russia will not simply forgive or forget once the guns fall silent. All of this points to a grim but increasingly unavoidable conclusion. The Western project in Ukraine has failed on every level. Militarily, it has not stopped Russia. Economically, it has not broken Russia. Geopolitically, it has pushed Russia into a stronger alignment with China, Iran, India, and the wider BRICS constellation, accelerating the erosion of Western hegemony. Europe is poorer, more divided, less secure, and more dependent on expensive American energy and weapons. Kyiv is bleeding men and losing territory. The global South is watching and drawing clear lessons about the West's unreliability and double standards. Russia, for its part, has paid a heavy price in blood and resources, but it has not been defeated. On the contrary, it has adapted, reoriented its economy, hardened its society, and strengthened its strategic depth through new alliances and trade routes. In this sense, the war in Ukraine has become a turning point not only for Eastern Europe, but for the entire international order. The attempt to use Ukraine as a proxy to weaken and isolate Russia has instead exposed the limits of Western power. The sanctions regime has driven major economies closer together outside the Western orbit. The dollar-dominated system is under increasing challenge as countries seek alternative settlement mechanisms and currency arrangements. The myth of Western invincibility has been punctured, while Russia has demonstrated that it can resist, absorb, and adapt under extreme pressure. The tragedy is that this lesson is being written in the blood of ordinary Ukrainians, sacrificed by their own leadership and by distant Western elites to a geopolitical experiment that has gone horribly wrong. Unless and until the West accepts reality, Russia's victory on the ground, the failure of the weakened Russia at all costs strategy, and the need to negotiate on terms that reflect that reality, the war will grind on, and Ukraine will continue to pay the highest price.